Hi, everybody. Today is the first day of Gemini, and so I'm creating a written piece and this video to go over Gemini and talk about how we can work with Gemini to really move forward in our lives. And for that aspect of self-development and cultivation, we just came out of Taurus and we started the zodiac year and cycle with Aries. So we've had this fiery energy, this watery energy, and now we have the first exposure of air energy. And there's a ton to cover. There's so much to talk about here. And I've been laughing to myself because I don't think that it's a matter that there's more to talk about when it comes to Gemini or air energies as much than rather than other elements, as much as when we enter into Gemini and we enter into the air energies, it's about communication. It's about information. It's about data and being able to talk about that data and break that data down. And so it's in its own way a little bit easier to talk about it. And so it creates a wider variety of subjects to cover. Whereas fire and our passion and that spiritual alignment, it's a bit more beyond words, right? And the subtleties of our emotional states in our inner world is beyond words. And so too is that earth energy and that physicality that sometimes is so, its complexity is held in its simplicity of this is just physical reality, right? These are our bodies. This is what we do in this physical space. And so Gemini just lends itself to increasing the amount of conversation that we can have about it and the amount of conversation we can have about that mental realm that air really is tying to in the astrological system, simply because this is the medium and this is the mode that we actually use to communicate. So today we're going to go through where we are in the seasonal process, and how that sort of ties into our own self-development and projects we might have and the development of a cycle. And then we're going to dive into a little bit more of Gemini specifically as a sign and some of the stories and meanings that relate to that as a sign. We'll go over the tarot cards associated with Gemini, and then we'll take a look at what this means about ourselves, what this means about our own psyche and our own mental space, especially since this is the first air sign of the zodiac. We're really going to talk about air and what that means and what it means in that mental space, right? Fire rules, passion rules, the spirit, water rules, emotions rules that inner realm of intuition and instinct. Air rules the cerebral space, that mental space and communication, and then earth rules physical reality, right? Our bodies and the lives that we create in that physical reality that we interact with. So we'll be touching a lot more on that air energy and that mental cerebral energy today. So there is a lot to cover. And we're going to start with it being Gemini season, right? So when we relate this to the 4 seasons, Gemini is at the very end of spring. Spring starts at the equinox, and so it starts with Aries, which starts at the equinox, and then it moves into Taurus and it moves into Gemini. So when spring first starts, you start to see the shoots of growing up from the ground. You start to see a little bit more green on the trees, and especially you start to see the beginning of buds on trees. And so life is really starting to wake up. You hear bird songs more. We're breaking out of the winter and the calm stillness and the cold of winter. That then develops into Taurus, where you start to see flowers really opening up and blooming. And what that always relates to me is that vessel aspect, right? Aries is that first start, that first flush of life back into the world, and that struggle to break out of the winter. Taurus is opening up and creating a vessel to hold life. And in relation to the elements, it is very much about our vessel, our body, and this physical reality able to hold life. So now that you have that spiritual life, and that spark of life. And then you have the physical body that contains that spark of life and allows that spark of life to interact with other sparks of life and the world around. It's time for Gemini season, where all of this gets pollinated and germinated. And that's really that aspect of, now we have these bodies with these sparks of life, they're interacting, and this is starting a germination process that will be carried on into Cancer season, where it gestates, right? And it creates something new from these interactions. But Gemini is the beginning of those real interactions. We look at it seasonally or as part of a developed cycle. So this is when plants are getting pollinated, right? And Gemini is an air sign, and it's interesting because pollination, it all occurs through air, right? It's bees, or it's birds, or it's butterflies. It's creatures that pollinate, typically from moving through the air. There might be some other insects that crawl, but mainly it's the air creatures. And then it's pollen on the wind and pollen on the breeze and seeds that get scattered throughout the wind and later on and take root. So I kind of jumped ahead on the cycle there, but that pollination, that happens here, right? And that happens in the season of Gemini. And it's very related to the ideas that spring up in Gemini, right? If we think of Gemini as an energy as far as it is portrayed throughout humanity, it's all about communication. It's all about gathering information, gathering data, and speaking that information, putting that data and information out there. And so it's constantly receiving and constantly putting out all these things that spark new life, right? And so it goes perfectly with that image of the seasons, where the flowers and the blooms are taking in pollen, trees are putting out pollen, and things are starting to germinate now, right? And as I said, this will continue on into Cancer season, where it gestates, and that continues on into Leo and down the cycle. But where this really speaks to us in our own personal process of self-development, or our own personal process of finishing a project, right? Like starting a project and carrying it through, is that there has to first be that Aries spark of life, right? We have to be alive to have this happen. A project really should have a spark of passion to be like, yes, this is something actually that I feel aligned with and that I want to do, to really give it the full embodied purpose and meaning that will carry it through to the greatest good, right? We can start things without that passion, most definitely, but they're probably not going to take on the full life and breath that they could if we originally had that passion. Then we need to be able to make space. We need to be able to bring this into the physical reality with Taurus. Maybe plan it out a bit and see step by step how we're going to do this. And along with this, it comes this brainstorming state of Gemini, where we're gathering information on like, how actually are we going to do this? We have the passion. We start to create a container, right? We start to say, this is a project. This is something we're doing. If it's our own personal development, we're like, yeah, this is my body. This is my life. This is what we're working in. And then we have to start to research, what are we doing actually, right? We have to gather our thoughts and our understanding of the systems that we're working in, and our understanding of the project that we're working in, and break these down a little bit and really get a strong grasp about what we are doing, and be able to, the other thing about Gemini, actually, let's show Gemini here real quick and take a look at the cycles. So Gemini, so we have Aries, we have Taurus, and then we have Gemini, who's ruled by Mercury. So we started with Mars in Aries, Venus in Taurus, and we have Gemini here now ruled with Mercury. Gemini is it is a mutable sign, so it is an adaptive sign. You start the process with a cardinal sign, you continue the process with a fixed sign, and then you adapt to anything that needs adaptation to. So it's a very flexible sign. And this works well for the season and it works well for the process because we can't, oftentimes, if you're going to carry a project all the way through, it's not going to exactly look like the first inspiration, right? It changes and it has to adapt because we take in new information. We see new ways in which things are relating to each other, and we have to be able to adapt to that. And so we have that adaptability of Gemini carrying us through this process. And so it can be really, really, it's an essential part of any part of our self-development. It is an essential part of any project. And I know that in the Gemini integration aspect of the workshop Returning to Nature's Rhythm, which is, if you haven't joined us yet, please join us. It's the alchemy tier. This is alchemy tier. And what we do is we take 3 weeks, and each week we have a lesson on how to integrate the science into our lives. And so I know that for this period of Gemini, what we're going to really be working on is how to break, the first week will be how to break things down through the Socratic method and thus understand things better from different points of view. And then we'll be really working on using the mental space of Gemini and the powers of the spoken word and the written word and the ability to manipulate mental space in order to really connect us to our emotional realms, our spiritual realms, and to really navigate that mental space. Now, why would we do that, right? Well, Mercury is the sign that rules over Gemini, and as we're going to see through the story of Gemini and the story of the Discari and the Tarot, Gemini just really, really embodies Mercury energy, right? And Mercury rules over our language. It rules over our ability to communicate. Mercury also was the messenger of the gods and a psychopomp, right? So not only does Mercury deliver messages of the divine, but Mercury escorts the soul into the afterlife and moves between all of these different realms of existence. In the same way, Jung saw Mercury as really the patron of working with the unconscious, and the alchemist saw Mercury as the patron of alchemy. So Mercury really represents this aspect of our consciousness, which allows us to be here in the physical realm, to see each other, to communicate with each other, to study and break things down until we understand the atomic composition of a molecule. And we're starting to break into what is happening as far as quarks and what is happening as far as subatomic particles. Mercury is what allows us to really understand that through our minds and to break things down on that level. It's also what allows us to explore our inner realms, right? We have that watery realm, but in order for us to understand it, we have to be able to channel some of this Mercury energy. We have to be able to bring that watery emotional instinct up and give its subtleties some words and some ways to communicate it, right? We can have the experience in the inner realms without that cerebral space, just by experiencing it. But if we want to be able to communicate it to other people, we have to be able to put words to it. And that's the same for every experience that we have, whether that be the watery realms or that be the fiery realms of passion and spirituality, or that be the physical realms. If we want to be able to share that with other people, if we want to be able to communicate those realms to other people, if we want to be able to intellectually understand these other realms, we have to bring in that air energy. We have to bring in that Mercury energy. And so Gemini really ends up being this space and this sign that connects so many of the rest of the spaces and signs. It also rules over the third house, which is the house of communication. And it really is that first manifestation of Mercury really starting to pool all these energies together. So it's a really essential energy. And when we're working with it, It means that we're able to bring in a greater understanding of everything that affects us in our own self-development, or everything that affects in a project, right? So we start with that passion in Aries. We have a container. This is my project. This is my life. This is my physical existence. And then we start to gather the information we need. Hey, what is a spiritual perspective on this? What is a physical, practical perspective on this? What is my emotional perspective on this? Mercury opens the doors to all these. He, in ancient philosophies and writings, he's talked about as being the key keeper or the opener of the ways. Because he's able to open these doors. And Gemini is the first of his signs, and really the first sign that opens the door wide enough for us to start to take in this information. And so I want to go over here the story of the Discovery in order to start to talk about how this is all related. But yeah, actually, I take that back. What I actually want to do is go back to, let's go back to the chart, and let's note something before we go into the story of the Discovery. These glyphs are all broken down into symbols now, but they each represent something that is a little bit less abstract, right? So we have Aries, which is represented by a ram. We have Taurus, which is represented by a bull. We have Gemini, which is represented by twins. Cancer, represented by a crab. Leo, represented by a lion. Virgo is represented by a virgin. Libra is represented by scales. Scorpio is represented by a scorpion. Sagittarius represented by the centaur archer or an archer. Capricorn represented by the half goat, half fish, which is inspired by Inky. Aquarius represented by the water pourer, and Pisces represented by the two fish. Gemini is the first of the signs that isn't animals, right? It's not that animal realm, it's humans, which, yes, we are animals. But the ancients saw that there is something a little bit different from that, right? Animals easily can be seen to express the energies of Aries, right? They have passions. My dog has a passion for food and for fetching, and for people. They have those natural instinctive drives that come with the first house, and with Aries, they want to have fun, they want to have sex, they want to have food. They obviously have bodies. They're very tied into this physical existence. And we know that they have emotions. Anyone who's ever had a pet knows that there is this whole emotional realm happening inside. And yes, they do have some intellect, right? My dog becomes a freaking engineer when it comes to getting food. He's incredibly intelligent. And he understands a little bit too much English, like we've come to discover. So they definitely have a level of intellect, and there are some incredible species that have an amazing amount of intellect, from crows to African greys to dolphins. There are some incredibly intelligent creatures out there and species. But I think it is important to note that the zodiac glyphs break with the cycle of animals and the purely natural state, with humans first here on an air sign. And the ancients really saw, and we can debate for days whether or not everything humanity does is natural anyways, because we evolved in a natural environment, and so the things that we construct and create are just another aspect of nature. That's cool. That's a cool, fun, intellectual discussion and debate that can come up with Gemini and with our air energy. No other creature around is going to be holding that debate, right? There's something there about our mental sphere that is able to communicate all these things. And in the symbol system of the zodiac, this starts with Gemini. And so we're going to talk here as we get into the stories of the Discovery, and we get into the stories of um, these creation myths that talk about that first light of, or that first spark of that human consciousness that seems to be a little bit different. And all the ancients had a way of talking about the difference of that human consciousness. And then we're going to go into the tarot cards. When we talk about this, we're really going to start to explore the duality that gets created when we enter into the mental space. And I think it's perfectly illustrated by the concept of the twins as this pure representation of duality, and the fact that it gives us a new way to interact with and manipulate the physical realm while creating a new sense of duality in the physical realm that you do not have, or you do not see amongst more instinctual based animals and more instinctual based environments and nature. So let's hop in and talk about the Discovery. The Discovery are two brothers in Greek myth that spread into Roman myth as well. They are the sons of Zeus and Leda. And they're actually, this isn't always talked about, they're actually the brothers of, I can't remember her name. I think it's Clymistera. Pronunciations are always interesting for me. And Helen of Troy. So the story actually goes that they get born from this egg, and it's two twin brothers, and two twin sisters. So it's a set of twins, right? Tons of dualities there. And most of us are familiar with the story of Helen of Troy, and that how it causes the fall of Troy. But also, through that story, it starts the very beginning of history, right? The heroes that fight in that story, the heroes that that are talked about in the Odyssey and in the Iliad, all of those were used as the progenitor ancestors of the different city-states of Greece. So it's not only the story of this like love, lust relationship that causes this big epic war. It is a story of how did all these city-states begin, right? Who are their ancestors? How are they all connected to the divine? Because that was an important part of the ancient stories as well. This person was the son of Venus, or the son of or Aphrodite, or the son of Mercury, or the son of Heracles, and this happens because they're all descendant from these events that happened. So it is the very foundation of Greek history, and since the West has built so much of its cultural identity on Greece, and especially with our democracies on Athens, it's the beginning of our concept and our cultural concept of Western history and Western culture and our Western mythos. And so the Discovery, or the sons of Zeus and Leda, one brother was seen to be immortal, was believed to be immortal, and the other brother was believed to be mortal. And just like in true Mercury fashion, who rules over them, they have some trickstery aspects to them, right? They went to go steal cows with their other cousins. Then they made a bet about who can eat the first cow fastest, and the other cousins win. So later on, when they're all hanging out together with Helen in Paris, the Discovery sneak off to go steal the cattle again, away from their cousins. And that leads to Paris running off with Helen, because he's now alone with Helen, because the other cousins went home. And it also leads to the other cousins and the Discovery battling with each other. And the mortal of the Discovery dies, right? And so Zeus gives them the option. He gives the immortal son, this is Pallas and Castor. And for right now, it is escaping me which one was immortal, which one was not. But he gives the immortal son the option to come live in Olympus forever with the gods, or to split his divinity, his godhood, with his brother. And so he chooses to split the godhood with his brother. And so they spend half their time in Olympus with the gods and half their time in the underworld in Hades. So they become literally demigods, right? They live out mortal lives. They live out a mortal afterlife. And yet, at the same time, they balance this with a divine afterlife. So they're now bridging the dualities, right? They're now really playing the role of Mercury, or very connected to that role of Mercury, from messenger of the gods in the heavens to messenger of the underworld and guide of the dead. And then also here in communication with the physical world. And the Dioscuri were beloved by the Greeks and the Romans. They were worshipped all over ancient Greece. They were believed to be descendants of the Spartan line, so they were particularly very important to the Spartans, and especially their political system, which had two kings. And so it was seen that the Dioscuri were the divine representation, or the hero representation of these two kings, which allowed them to be able to go out into war with one king and have somebody else still at home ruling and continuing the just rule of Sparta. And that, I think, is going to be an important note that I will come back to, where we can really use this Gemini energy to make sure that we're connected to the divine when we're both internal and when we're external, right? But I'm going to save that piece for a little bit in the future. Other symbols that get connected to the Dioscuri are always shown with horses, and this also connotes aspects of travel, or this also links them to aspects of travel, which is very connected to Mercury. So that's the origin myth of Gemini, right? Is they become the semi-divine, or this divine hero combination, and then they also get put up into the stars. And that opens the door to this concept of the dualities that exist, right? And especially the dualities that exist in the human mind, right? Without the human mind, as far as we know, we wouldn't have a concept of the heavens or the concepts of the after realm for humans. We wouldn't have concepts or designations of gods, humans, or heroes. We wouldn't have these concepts of dualistic states. As far as we know in the natural realm, that isn't something that comes up. You live, right? You live and you move forward. You survive. You eat. You mate. You have offspring. But you don't create designations. You don't create stories. You don't create stories of what happens after things you don't know. That all opens up with the mind. And where we see this in ancient literature is you see this in the Adam and Eve tale of the garden, but you also see this in other stories all around the world, where there was this primordial innocence, this primordial connection to nature. You have this in Native American tales, where different Native American figures, whether that be Spider Woman or Crow or whatever figure it is that is really sacred to that tribe, establishes humanity. And humanity grows and they thrive and they're one with nature, and it's this idyllic state. And then we start to invent things. We start to use our minds. We start to use our consciousness. We start to use our words and our tools to create things, and we go to war with each other and we destroy the world. So the world has to be recreated. Or we overhunt and we destroy the world, so the world has to be created. Or we create new technologies that destroy the world, and the world has to be created. These myths are all throughout time. The Babylonians had a myth about Shamhat and Enkidu. Enkidu was seen as this kind of primordial human beast-like, right? Like part beast, part man figure who later goes on epic quest with the Gilgamesh. But he is he runs with the natural order, right? He runs with the antelope. He hangs out with the lions. He's part of nature. And then Shamhat, this woman who's often portrayed as being a sacred prostitute, goes and she sleeps with him for like 7 or 9 days. I don't remember which, but she seduces him, right? And when they're done with this seduction, he tries to enter back into nature and everything runs away from him. He's no longer part of the natural cycle, no longer part of the natural order. So he goes to the cities and that's where he challenges Gilgamesh, and then they become buddies instead. But you see this narrative that when consciousness opens up, we are now distanced from the natural order of things and from the physical realm. There's this whole other space of consciousness that opens up. And it's really interesting because it does distance us. It distances us through our technology. It distances us through the fact that we are experiencing everything through this mental filter that has its own biases, its own cultural conditionings, its own experiential conditionings that cause us to look at things different ways, that cause us to see things outside of the actual reality of things. It completely changes our perspective on the world, which can be both devastating and really useful, right? No other creature around the world knows how to like heal its broken arm when with a brace when it gets broken. Our ability to understand nature and to look at it as if from outsiders allows us to manipulate it. I mean, obviously we have these houses, we have cars, we have tech. I'm talking to you from a computer screen. This mental realm that air rules over, and that starts here with Gemini, has created a whole bunch of options. And that can be both good and that can be bad. We've also created ways to destroy the world with nuclear armaments and ways to devastate ourselves and nature with pollution and manufacturing and with our wars. And so it allows us to interact with and manipulate everything in just a whole variety of ways. Those tend to all be physical ways. If we're talking emotions and we're talking that watery realm, it's really interesting to me because I had my cat Kona, who I absolutely loved. He had a really rough life growing up. I adopted him later. And so he was great. He was super attached because he's like, oh, thank you guys for like adopting me. I actually adopted him from a friend who adopted him from that rough life. And he was super attached to my friend and super attached to me. And it created all this personality and warmth, and I loved him. And near the end of his life, there was a good year of his body just falling apart. And I know from working with people with trauma that is what happens, right? The body gets so used to stress that it just starts to stress itself out. And people will try to cope with that. And if they don't have the right coping mechanisms, then they can destroy themselves doing it. He would lick all of his fur off and just do all these things that we tried to remedy, but we couldn't. It was his own way of just dealing with that pent up trauma. And so it really was an illustration to me how, yes, that mental sphere of trying to deal with the emotional realm can turn disastrous for humans, right? We can create drugs, boil up heroin, cook up some heroin and take that, which an animal's not going to be able to do, to try to deal with our traumas. But we also have the ability to actually process our emotions through this mental realm in a way that animals can't, and to heal our traumas through understanding our bodies better, through understanding our brains better, through physical work that is meant to help us process through traumas, through talk therapy. None of these are options that animals have. So this realm of air opens up a duality in all the other realms. This mental space opens up a duality in all the other realms. And you see that in origin stories the world over, where there was this childlike primordial state that turns into us dawning into a new concept of who we are, an awakening of consciousness that then sets the dominoes into motion between creating great wonders and great destruction. And you see that in the tarot. Let's go to the Lovers. Gemini is often related to the Lovers in tarot. And so I need to pull it up. You're seeing it, but I'm not seeing it because that's how this all works. Where are you, Lovers? Shoot. Okay, so here we are. We got the Lovers. So you have essentially, you have a male and a female thought of as Adam and Eve, typically, because tarot came out of a Christian tradition. You have an angel looking over them with the rays of the sun and the divine behind the angel. You have the tree of good and evil, right? Knowledge of good and evil, knowledge of duality, knowledge of things that we can do that create a better world and things that we can do that create a worse world. And you also have this tree of life, right? The tree of the fire and the passions. There's some other subtleties here too. You have Adam, who is masculine, and so is often related to like that Aries fiery energy. And he is here checking out Eve, who is related to that Taurus earth energy. And so you have that passion who's like, oh, hey, earth, right? Oh, hey, physicality. Hey, body. Hey, Taurus. And it's interested in there. And then you have that Taurus aspect, that Taurus embodiment, who's also typically related to, women are often related to the water element, looking at the angel, and so this super consciousness. And so a lot of people relate this to the physicality, the world of the physical and the passions, connecting to the world of the unconscious and the or the subconscious and the realm that lies beneath, which then points us to the superconscious. Or the spiritual realm. You also have aspects of the masculine and feminine coming together from this phallic mountain, and the waters that are above that could like pour down, and the sky above. And so you have this coming together of the masculine and the feminine energies. And you, once again, you have this nod to that moment when consciousness opens up. And I just see this personally as the transition between species like Homo erectus into Homo sapien, right? That movement from, okay, we are animal, we are creature, we are just one of the many things operating in this environment, into I am human, I build towns, I grow crops, I do all these things. The story of Adam and Eve moves from the Garden of Eden into planting, and right, like they're just wandering in the garden eating food. And then suddenly, once they are expelled from the garden, they're planting crops, their sons are raising animals, they're starting to control nature, which requires all the resources of Gemini and being able to speak, being able to observe, being able to take in information, give that information, pass it on, apply that information. And so you have the agricultural revolution and everything that comes from there. Like life didn't necessarily get easier after the agricultural revolution, but it did get a hell of a lot more complicated. And that's where I wanted to draw a parallel between this aspect of the Lovers and the way that the mind, this introduction of consciousness to the world, which can be seen as that first human side. That was something I wanted to point out here real quick. That introduction of humanness to the world. Oh, and I had closed it. First seen here, and let's see, does that, no. Okay, first seen here in that Gemini sign. Also is seen here. So you have Gemini, which is the two twins. You have Libra, which is an instrument, right? It's scales. And then you have Aquarius, which is the water bearer. There are no animal or natural symbols other than like the water that gets poured out with the air signs. So it really does set up this human uniqueness, this unique experience that we have in this realm of the intellectual, in this realm of air, which both has its idyllic garden story, but also the shackles that come from that. So we have the lovers, we have this uniting of the masculine and feminine, we have this ability to understand the universe in a whole new way, understand the cosmos in a whole new way, to come up with concepts like the spiritual aspect of the feminine and the masculine coming together. You don't get that amongst animal populations, right? Like they understand more than well that there's a physical aspect of the male and female coming together. But you don't necessarily have a contemplation of how that it happens in all levels of the cosmos. And you can see that atomically between the atomic force between a proton and a neutron, or you can see that spiritually between, let's say, Sephiroth and Bina and Hakma coming together in this divine unity of understanding and wisdom. All of that is made possible through the gifts of intellect and air and Gemini and communication and information. It also, though, creates the duality of getting stuck, getting really, really stuck in this. The card that gets related a lot to the lovers, it's not necessarily traditionally related to Gemini, but it gets related to the lovers is the devil, where in the flip reverse of that the lovers card where you have an angel overseeing things, here you have the devil overseeing things. You have a man, you have a woman, and they're chained. They're chained to materiality. And you can see this. You can see this a lot in the dualities that pop up with Gemini and the dualities that pop up in human consciousness. Not only can it create a better world, it can create a world where we are chained to our circumstances. Think about poverty, think about drug addiction, think about the traumas that occur from war, the traumas that occur from poverty and drug addiction. All these are created through mental spaces that we then use to shape the physical realm that then shapes us, right? And so you have this duality, you have this aspect that opens up with the mind, opens up with this realm of air, opens up with this realm of mental processes. And it was interesting to me to think about this because I'm like, oh yeah, like this can represent the people who are really obsessed with the physical realm and maybe shackled to it because we only see what's physically there, and we want to control that and manipulate that. Like, okay, that can represent the devil. And then it popped up like, yeah, and people who try to escape that physical realm, right? How many artists, how many inventors are all up in their head and in this cerebral space and suffer from it because the physical realm is being ignored, and yet it's asking its tithe, it's asking for its due, right? How many inventors create amazing inventions and they can barely afford to eat because they're just not engaged enough in the physical realm. And so the physical realm controls them rather than them being able to invoke both sets of the twins, both sets of the Discovery, and invoke, I closed that card, but invoke both sets of the twins and be able to walk with their passions, right? And walk in the physical realm and unite these in an understanding of this air element that can explore both realms and the supernatural realm and tie them all together in spirit, passion, physicality, and emotion. So the other cards that get represented or that represent Gemini is the Knight, which represents the last two, the Knight of Swords, which represents the last two decans of Taurus, and the first decan of, right? Or is that? Yeah, the last two decans of Taurus. It's always 2, 1. And the first decan of Gemini. Now, the knight, he's rushing off. This is when we get a new idea. And we're like, we're going to do that thing now, right? We are going to get that done. That is brilliant. This is fantastic. He doesn't necessarily check out what else he needs to know. He just sort of rushes into it. And this can be Gemini energy to the max. Gemini is like, what is going on over there? What is going on over there? I want to see that. I want to learn about that. I want to learn about that and that and that. I have a Jupiter in Gemini, first house. I know how this thing goes. And that is, it's just a natural part of that energy. It's curious. The mind is naturally curious. It wants to learn. It wants to explore. And that can be great. But we're going to want to bring some stability to that process so that we don't only just cherry pick a whole bunch of different information, but we carry things through their entire process, which is why the zodiac requires all the other signs so that we can carry things through. And so that brings us into the next card, which rules the last 2 decans of, and let me try to find it so I can actually look at it. That rules the last 2 decans of Gemini, leading into Cancer. And so it's the Queen of Cups. She's holding this vessel. She's holding this vessel. It's cupped over, so people talk about that as like she's looking into her own inner vessel, her own inner realm. And it's created this space. It's interesting to me because these 2 cherubs look very much like the description of the cherubs of the Ark of the Covenant. So she's holding this sacred space. She has angels above her. She has water flowing down. She's seated. She is a queen, and so she has this very stabilized energy. So when we go out and we gather information, we want to bring that information in. We want to sit with it. We want to look at what is going on within, what is going on in the depths of this information. We want to bring in the intuitions of the higher realms. We want to bring in the intuitions of the watery realms. We want to feel it out emotionally. We want to sit with it physically and let it gestate, which brings us into the process of Cancer and gestation. So when we're working with this Gemini energy, we are working to gather in our information and to turn that into something that we can then gestate and grow and create. And while we're doing this, we need to be mindful of the duality that our mental space creates. It creates biases. It creates, it forces a particular, not a particular perspective, but the way that the mental realm works, it necessitates that we are looking at things from a subjective point of view. There will always be other points of view to see it from. And that's where that image of the Discordia, that image of the twins is super important, because if we really, 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 really want to get to the reality of the situation, we want to be able to look at that reality of the situation from as many different points of view as possible. And so that's really what we want to invoke here with Gemini, to gather in as much information as possible, to look at points of view, or look at something from as many points of view as possible, to then talk to other people about it and get their point of view, to do research in other realms and get its point of view of other authors and other people who do this research. Gather in all this point of view so that we can actually get a perspective of what is really there, because there is that mental separation between us and the physical realm. It all gets processed through the mind, and the mind twists it according to the different biases of the mind and the different ways that the mind has been conditioned. And that is what we're working on, working through, acknowledging, and finding tools and resources to help us through that process. Meditation and figuring out how your mind works is going to be one of the best ways through this. Journaling is a fantastic way through this. Talking with friends and asking friends and loved ones what their perspective on things are is an amazing way to do this. All of these things, or at least the journaling and writing, and then talking, very Gemini energies. Meditation, I think, is more just, it should be a practice with this Gemini energy. And then other tools like researching, going through self-coaching so that we make sure we're asking important questions and getting important points of view. And then anything that we can do that invokes multiple perspectives. So you'll hear me talk a lot about working with the week and the 7 days of the week, so that each day of the week you can create a different perspective. You can enter into a different perspective on a subject. So Monday, you can work with the unconscious because it's ruled by the moon, and the moon rules over the unconscious. So you can work with the unconscious and your instincts and emotions. Tuesday, you can work with your passions and what is really feeling like it's driving you in a project or in your own self-development. Wednesday, you can work with this more analytic space and communicative space. Thursday, you can work more with faith and that kind of supernatural aspect of it all. Friday, you can work with, like, how does this all connect, right? How does this all connect, and how does this all connect me to other people in my community? Saturday, you can look at the consequences of it all. And Sunday, you can choose, like, how do I manifest this thing? How does it manifest through me? How does this really let the truth of who I am shine, right? It's the sun, Sunday. And so that gives you 7 different perspectives to go through things. And that's the kind of stuff we want to do with Gemini. We want to germinate new ideas, foster new ideas by gaining as much perspective as possible. Okay, thank you. This has been a really long one. Like I said, it's Gemini. And that's just kind of how it goes, because there's so many words to use to describe this weird cerebral experience that we have. Thank you. Blessings on your work with Gemini. I would love to have you join us, if you haven't already, in the Returning to Nature's Rhythm Facebook group, where we talk about all sorts of stuff and how to integrate in our lives. And if you haven't joined the Returning to Nature's Rhythm workshop on Patreon, we are going to dive in here in the next 3 weeks. Every day or every week, we will have a different lesson on how to integrate Gemini into our lives, from Socratic coaching, so Socratic questioning method, to how to work with word association, to enter into different states of consciousness to give us more perspective, and then also how to use words in those states of consciousness to really alter our perspective, really alter our mental space, from calling in divine help to exercising the things we don't want there anymore. And there's reasons why we're doing that, and you'll hear about that more in the workshop. Also, we have another tier of that is the Dream and Tide tier, where we work with each full moon and each new moon and how to integrate those energies into our lives of that particular full moon and that particular new moon. And then we do guided meditation. So there's a ton of stuff there as paid content, and it helps me produce these videos, helps me give me time and space to do all the rest of the free content that I put out there. So you're more than welcome to join us. I would love for you to join us. And yeah, if you have any questions, reach out, particularly here on the video and the comments, so that everyone else can get to see the answers and the dialogue that happens, so we can all cross-pollinate. It's fantastic. Okay, so blessings on your Gemini season and on all the work you're doing. Thank you. Bye.